so what I'm going to be talking about is how you use partnerships in addressing the kind of the way that the National Housing Strategy aspirationally would like to be developing, which is around a rights-based approach. They've actually explicitly said that, but there has been not very much meat on that, and I don't really eat meat, so I know that I can see when there's not meat there, and I found it quite amusing that one of the first workshops they had on the rights-based approach to the National Housing Strategy, they had it in Vancouver, which is probably the worst place to have it because they got a lot of they got a lot of really interesting feedback, which I think scared the hell out of them, right? Including a number of lawyers who sort of reminded them what the implications of a rights-based approach to housing might be in terms of challenges, legal challenges. So in a number of cities in the world, and also in Canada, we have what we're now calling a housing affordability crisis. We've had this for a number of years, but now people are actually acknowledging it, and there has been some changes, and it's also, as somebody mentioned, in terms of the politics of it, it is impacted politics. We, in Vancouver, a party, the Vision Party, which was elected based on their saying they were going to get rid of homelessness, which they didn't do, was turfed out of office in the recent election in October, and now we have a really interesting a new council in the city of Vancouver, which includes a mayor who's an independent and a whole variety of different people who belong to different jurisdictions. So the housing affordability crisis in Vancouver and in other places is really, it's been due to what people are calling the decoupling of incomes from housing payments. So in a place like Vancouver, there's really no correlation between what the average incomes are of people and what house prices are. And as Ron sort of showed, Vancouver has one of the lowest social assistance rates, I mean, all of these things, and we have one of the highest house prices in Canada. So, but it isn't just a problem of the decoupling. It's really a systemic problem, which is to do with the way government has addressed this and the kind of social practices. I mean, in the encouragement of home ownership has really, I think, to the detriment of of developing robust other sectors like purpose-built rental or co-op housing. And of course, and again, as Ron mentioned, I mean, it's really affected the most low income, the people that are homeless or at risk of homeless. I think we could have an interesting discussion because I think it is really also affecting a whole swatch of the middle class as well that are increasingly becoming disenfranchised. I mean, their aspirations are being really severely curtailed. And Ron may sort of see this as just something, an irritant, but if this is affecting a whole segment of, say, the millennials, which is an age cohort, this is significant. So what I argue in this paper is that housing really should be seen as social infrastructure. And housing is really established now as a social determinant of health. So any of the public health literature really talks about how the importance of affordable, healthy, adequate housing. But that sort of definition of what the determinants of health is really often focused on most vulnerable populations who face multiple health and employment barriers. And I think that that's what the policies I think in Canada, we've mostly focused on people that have multiple barriers, seniors and seniors. Now, those policies are changing, like in a place like BC, where we're actually recognizing that we have to also be addressing the the missing middle. And so that's why, I think a rights-based approach would broaden that focus. So in the Canadian National Strategy, what they've talked about is that adequate housing is no longer just a need, but it should be a right of every citizen. And again, I'm prefacing that because I have not seen enough evidence that they're really making that sort of embedded in their policies at this time, but that's what's actually written in the national housing strategies. What I think is you really need to be looking at is the premise that affordable, safe, and secure housing should be stimulating the economic activity and creates healthy communities. So I found it interesting. There was a question at the event last night where somebody was talking about the Singapore model. And I know we cannot replicate the Singapore model, but what they used housing, and they had a Ministry of Housing that was central to the development of Singapore as one of the most advanced developed economies, because they saw the importance of providing affordable, safe, secure housing as a way for other kinds of economic activity to be furthered. Whereas what we've done in North America is that there's a real estate economic sector, which is really significant. I mean, in a place like Vancouver, you sort of people always come to Vancouver and say, well, what do people actually do here? And there is industries, but there's no major head offices. I mean, there's lots of things there. We have a really booming marijuana industry, so that's something that there was a lot of underground economy that has now become above ground. But the idea that housing could be stimulating other aspects of the economy was really not thought of. It was really seen as real estate as itself was the economic driver. So that stimulated the construction industry. It stimulated the resale industry. It stimulated all sorts of things. So right now, the provincial government is really wealthy because of property transfer taxes, which people have to pay because there was such a boom in real estate activity. And when you look at Vancouver, I mean, the real estate industry is one of the largest industries in BC, or at least in the Lower Mainland. So, and so what if you were looking at it in this other way? Then what government intervention would be is a way to stabilize the market and provide gaps in housing provision. And in order to do that, you really have to look at the housing delivery system, which I don't think has really been done in any kind of systemic way for a number of years. You have to look at what would be the need for the full spectrum of housing. How do you provide equitable and secure forms of tenure? And given that the way that at least the nonprofit sector has developed, how would you actually look at a multi-sectoral approach? Because that has been, I think, one of the real innovations in Canada right now is the development of a really strong nonprofit sector that has really pulled its weight far beyond what its resources. So this is just a sort of a brief look at what a housing system would be that would be developing all these that would be addressing the whole spectrum of housing. So, reconceptualizing the housing market. As I said before, I think you would look at the real estate industry, rather than looking at the real estate industry being the main economic generator, the housing system is used to support the development of economic activity. And that it is used to meet the needs of the population and provide a base for people to move forward in their lives. So what you would need to do is look at a range of housing, and it wouldn't just be affordable housing, but it would also, I would say, workforce housing, which is a term that we're using in Canada, but it was developed in the U.S. and is used much more in the U.S. And affordable housing would be for those over 30% of gross income to those whose median income is between 60% and 120% of average mean income in a locality. And then it would be the percentage of income spent on housing that will be deemed affordable. But it can be, if there is other things like public transit or it's in a walkable neighborhood, that could also be offset in terms of what that percentage of income spent on housing. So right now we use 30% of income, which in a place like Vancouver is really meaningless because there's such a high percentage of people in the different, from very low income to middle to even to upper middle income people that are spending so much more on housing. And then there would be workforce housing for those people in like essential services, teachers, teachers, first responders, police, medics, those kinds of things. That would be between 80% and 200% of the average income in a locality. And in order to do this, you would, I'm suggesting that the power of multi-sectoral partnerships really can be very effective in sort of furthering these kinds of goals, of providing that kind of spectrum of housing that we're looking at. Because it allows for the input from a variety of different actors. And there's, to allow for more collaborative and consensus-based decision making, it's interaction among partners and a shared accountability for outcomes and results. So the benefits of a multi-sectoral partnerships would be access to resources, more holistic approaches to problem identification, and gaining new understanding and insights through post-occupancy evaluations and others. So it would be a very iterative process. The challenges in any kinds of partnerships, and I think most of you know, are the imbalances, who has control of funding and capacity, conflicting values, problems with accountability, within decentralized administrative structures. So if anybody's been involved in trying to negotiate sort of partnerships, they understand the kind of complexities of trying to do that within a kind of milieu that doesn't necessarily want or encourage this kind of collaborative work. So I wanted to just present two cases of multi-sectoral partnerships in BC to give you some sense of what I think is possible in our current climate. And I have to sort of preface this is that BC has had a real sea change. Besides the change in government 3 years ago, 2017, we had a change in the provincial government, and we have now a new Democratic Party, which is center-left, and in coalition with the Green Party. The Green Party have 3 seats, but they hold the kind of balance and power again. And so it's been an interesting kind of relationship and partnership on how to sort of move forward in certain kinds of initiatives. But at least for the Community Land Trust, this was developed way before the government came in. The modular supportive housing was an initiative that came after. So I know in in U.S. and I know in other jurisdictions there are a number of community land trusts in a variety of different ways. Canada just doesn't have a model of community land trusts as strong as other places, but community land trusts are nonprofit corporation created to acquire and hold land for the benefit of community and provide secure, affordable access to land and housing for community residents. So there's the critical thing about this is that there's a dual ownership structure. The land is separated from the buildings, which allows for negotiation on what the value of the land is, which is in a place, in a lot of high, very expensive locales. That's the critical issue. It isn't the buildings, it's the land. And so the use of community land trusts allows for it creates a deeds restriction to keep units affordable in perpetuity. Allows the seller the appreciation in building value and improvements, but removes appreciation in land value. And it's a fixed option to purchase by the Community Land Trust on resale. And there's a specified class of qualified future buyers. So there's a sort of a kind of contract that has to be developed in order to sort of make this work. So the specific community land trust that was developed, that has been first of its kind, and now it is actually being replicated. So even before this is finally been occupied, which it will be in December, this project, there's been approval for sort of hundreds of other units to be going by this. So the Community Land Trust was created by the Co-op Housing Federation of BC, which is like the BC Nonprofit Housing Society. It's an umbrella organization of all the co-op housing in BC, and the co-op for the co-op in Canada was developed in between about the 70s, 80s, and 90s as a housing alternative that allowed people to be having a share of a unit of the development in, and then their housing payment was based on their income, so that people bought into a co-op, and then their ongoing payment was based on their income. So if their income changed, their housing payment would change. The support from this all came from the federal government, and in the mid-1990s, they stopped. The federal government stopped any kind of subsidies on mortgages, and they stopped building co-op housing. BC is one of the few provinces that are still building co-op housing and still has a very active co-op housing sector. So this was initiated as a kind of way of sort of furthering the goals of co-op housing, but also providing housing for a whole range, for a whole sector of the population. So there was a co-op that had 188 units, there were actually 188 and then 90 units on 2 different sites. There was 2 housing societies, one of them TICA, which was a faith-based housing society, and the other one Sanford Housing Society, which provided housing for people that recently left prison. And this was made possible through the City of Vancouver did a call for proposals for sites that they had was part of their in their land bank, and the land trust won the contract for 4 sites. And what they did in those 2 sites, and I'll go into this a little bit more, but I just wanted to talk about some of these other. There's 4 sites. 2 of the sites are for a profit. So they're actually renting out or renting them out at market rates, which are using as a subsidy for the nonprofit housing that's being created. So this was made possible not just by the City of Vancouver, but it was made possible by Vancity, which is Vancity Credit Union, which is one of the largest credit unions in in Canada. It's a financial institution, it's only in BC, but it's a member-driven and member-owned credit union where, again, you have a share in the credit union, and it operates like a financial institution, but it has also got a mandate to be doing community funding and supporting community initiatives. And BC Housing, which is the government, it's called the BC Housing Commission, that has, they also supported this by providing a low interest mortgage. And Vancity Credit Union brought in New Market Funds, which is sort of a funding. It's a private sector funding agency, but its intention is to be doing social venture sort of investing. And so there was a range of sort of financing tools that went into this project. So I'm just going to talk about a continuum of social financing from venture philanthropy, grants tied to specific outcomes, which is what BC Housing did, impact first, partner equity, co-investor equity. That was the different housing societies were expected to actually fundraise to contribute funding. And prioritize community impacts, blended investments where financial returns and community benefit share in equal status, and mortgage financing from government or a social finance institution. So Vancity provided the financing for this, and BC Housing secured that mortgage. So there was a real, this was an incredibly complex partnership that has been very, was only really possible from the years of sort of partnership building that has been occurring in British Columbia by these different partners. So BC Housing, even though it's a private sector housing that provides housing, that builds and manages and supports housing, they also work very extensively with the nonprofit sector. Vancity works with all of the different partners in this, and the individual housing societies really had, knew about each other because of the different organizations they belong to, like BC Nonprofit Housing. So it's been a very, it made it possible, not to say there weren't problems in this. So I know we have to, okay. So the land trust, yes, okay, 5 minutes. Okay, so the land trust portfolio project, as different from most other land trusts, was based on the fact that that they're using some of the development to support other development, and that's actually an innovation in this kind of in this project. And the fact that nonprofit partners have invested $4 million of their own equity. So this is what a part of the project looks like. These are the part below here. These are townhouses and that's for the TIFA housing, which are going to have 3 and 4 bedroom units. The towers are the co-op, and again, this is also part of the core. And it'll be finished in December. So some of the benefits of this was the affordability derived from the portfolio approach, cross subsidies with the project, discounted land because the city gave this land to the project, and strong participation of the social finance institutions. The challenges are the complexity of decision making, innovative nature of project created delays with the city. Yes, it really took a long time for people to get their head around what's being done. And it was the difficulty of achieving affordability to very low income without senior level government funding. So I'm now going to very briefly talk about the modular supportive housing, which is something that was introduced with the provincial government, which was 2,000 units. They announced this as soon as they got elected, 2,000 units of housing specifically for homeless people. And they saw this as a rapid response to homelessness. The BC government invested $291 million to build and $172 million to operate. It's being operated by nonprofit housing societies. It's a BC solution because the modules are built off-site in Kamloops, BC, which is a small city in the interior of BC, in an especially retrofitted factory, and moved to the building where it's assembled in, yes, 90 days. And so I've had tours of many of these. This is one that was just up and running in the summer. And so this is, given that they just came to power in June of 2017, and the fact that they've got, a number of projects up and running is quite amazing. And these are, they have industrial kitchens, they have studio apartments. And so the partnership is with the provincial government, the municipal government provides the land, the nonprofit housing providers operate and provide support to tenants, and the private sector is building the modules. It's meeting the needs of the most desperate housing. Some of them are going to be seen as more permanent, but others are going to be temporary. So because they are modular, they can be disassembled and moved to another location, and it's really providing economic development. The challenges is the opposition by residents, in some locales. But BC Housing has set up something called the community association committees, or neighborhood sort of association committees where residents are getting to sort of air their grievances, and that's alleviating some of the problems with it. So, what are the lessons learned? I think just to conclude is if you're going to be really doing something that is addressing a right to housing rather than you have to be looking at the kind of whole range of housing needs. And you also have to be really reassessing the underlying values, attitudes, and myths in our planning policies and housing delivery system. When you have, when you have sort of a recognition that people need to be housed as the supportive housing is, immediately it sort of really changes the kind of priorities. And how do you do that? Because we have such a homelessness population right now, how do you do this immediately? And the fact that we can do this in 90 days, I think, is quite significant. So thank you.